All right, so I'd like to thank the ILSI North America Sodium Committee for inviting me here today. I am happy to be here this afternoon on behalf of the National Salt and Sugar Reduction Initiative, which is a program that's convened by the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. Some of you have been part of this effort in the past, while this framework might be new to others. I'm delighted to be here to continue our work together and to talk to you more about our past efforts on sodium reduction and where we're headed next. And I'm enjoying learning more about your work and the process of being here with you today. So a quick summary before we dive into the details. The NSSRI initially started as the National Salt Reduction Initiative, or the NSRI for short. At this point in time, we were only focused on sodium reduction. It was an initiative that started in 2009, launched by the New York City Health Department, which convened a partnership of over 100 health authorities and organizations from across the country. And the goal was to ask industry to voluntarily reduce and commit to sodium reduction. And this was both in packaged and in restaurant foods. Ultimately, we wanted to do this as a way to reduce sodium intake and reduce heart disease and stroke risk. We estimated that if we could decrease sodium content in the food supply by 25%, we could decrease population sodium intake by about 20%. So working with industry, we collaboratively set sodium reduction targets for packaged food and restaurant categories. 28 companies ended up committing to the initiative. Some are here in the room today. And we analyzed changes in the food supply over time and observed a sodium density decline of about 6.8% from baseline in 2009 through 2014. And the work accomplished on sodium really serves as a model for continuous engagement of industry. So I want to start today with the rationale for our efforts on sodium reduction because I think it helps set the stage for why we launched the initiative. I know some of these statistics are familiar to you, and we just received a comprehensive overview from Dr. Stallings. So as you know, dietary risks are the leading risk factor of death in the US, which I've highlighted here in that top bar in red. The other bar that's highlighted in red is high blood pressure, and that's ranked here as the third highest risk factor. So we know that high blood pressure is a leading risk factor for heart disease and stroke, which is among the top 5 leading causes of death in the nation. And we know that high blood pressure affects 1 in 3 Americans and is responsible for about 1,000 deaths per day. As a local health department, our responsibility is to protect and promote the health of all New Yorkers. So when we look at these statistics, we're charged with thinking about how we can prevent high blood pressure and heart disease among New Yorkers. And we need to think about how a local health department can use its power to impact policies, systems, and the environment to change what this graph looks like. We know that high blood pressure is a common result of excessive salt intake and that Americans are eating far too much sodium in a day. The official recommendation from the dietary guidelines is to limit sodium intake to 2,300 milligrams per day, which, as we just heard, is the number that's consistent with the recent DRI report. And as we can see here, on average, US adults are consuming far above that. So we know that lowering blood pressure saves lives and reducing salt intake will lower blood pressure. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about the global case for sodium reduction in the years surrounding the launch of the NSRI. We're seeing a lot of national and international attention being paid to this topic. So on the national stage, the Institute of Medicine released their report on strategies to reduce sodium intake in 2010, in which they stated that the food industry, government, professional organizations, and public health partners should work together to promote voluntary collaborations to reduce sodium in foods. Also in 2010, we saw Healthy People 2020 come out, which included national health objectives, including reducing sodium reduction. We saw the American Heart Association release their presidential advisory, which called for population-wide reduction in salt intake. And then we saw the 2010 dietary guidelines for Americans come out in early 2010, which called for reduction in sodium to 2,300 milligrams per day. On the international stage, as we heard from Vicki Target earlier today, the United Kingdom launched a coordinated effort that was voluntary, where they engaged industry and set sodium targets across 80 food categories in 2008 and 2010. We know that Canada released their draft targets for over 150 categories in 2010. Australia released food and health dialogues in March of 2011, and additionally, the Pan American Health Organization established an expert group to develop recommendations to reduce population-wide dietary salt intake. All this to say, it was clear that sodium reduction was top of mind both in the US and across the globe. So back in New York, we began to hold preliminary discussions with the food industry in 2008 about reducing sodium via a voluntary program. And they expressed support, but noted their interest in a national approach. While New Yorkers tend to think that we're the city in the center of the universe, it turns out that food companies are not just making food for New York City, but are instead making foods for national distribution. And so a local approach just didn't make sense. So as a result, we began to have conversations with some of our public health partners and colleagues from other cities about the idea of a voluntary sodium reduction program, and we received feedback that they were interested in banding together. So we all saw value in making a joint ask of having a group of organizations come together to make one consistent request of the food industry. So our strategy for the NSRI has a few key components that I'll walk through today during this presentation, which includes building a partnership, setting targets, inviting company commitments, and then monitoring changes over time. So first, we built a strong partnership of other health authorities and organizations working on sodium, both to demonstrate the national interest in sodium reduction, but also to come together to learn from one another as a learning collaborative. So New York City built this coalition of over 100 partners from across the country. They include state and local health departments and national health organizations like the American Heart Association, who we're happy to have in the room with us today and has been a long-term partner of ours. So this coalition engaged in a public-private partnership with representatives from all sectors of the restaurant and the packaged food industry, which included packaged food brands, private label companies, food distributors, trade associations, and food service companies. And the organizations that we represent have come together to make a consistent call to industry, expressing a clear and cohesive message about our public health priorities. So the next part of our strategy is to actually go about setting the targets. The New York City Health Department set sodium reduction targets for 62 packaged food and 25 restaurant categories for 2012 and 2014, engaging industry in the process along the way. So now I'll go over the specifics of the framework and describe how we went about setting these targets. So as we've heard a couple of times today, where does all the sodium in our diets come from? And we know that about 70% of the sodium we consume come from packaged and restaurant foods, making them the main source of sodium in the diet. So it makes it really challenging for individuals to adequately reduce their sodium intake on their own. So when thinking through strategies of what we could do as a local health department to reduce sodium intake, it was important for us to remember that the salt shaker at the table was not the primary problem. And we saw this as a great opportunity for industry to be able to make small changes that could have an enormous impact on population health. So when we look at sodium sources by food item, what you can see from this pie chart is that no individual category is particularly overwhelming in terms of its sodium contribution to the diet. So the biggest section, this 44%, is mixed dishes, which came up earlier. And you can see in the bar on the right that this is really broken out into items like pizzas, burgers, sandwiches, meat dishes, grain dishes, and soups. So taken together, we know that the average American is consuming far too much sodium and is well beyond the daily limit, but that the salt in the processed and restaurant food by source is fairly varied. And again, we saw this as an opportunity because we thought that if small, gradual changes could be made across a range of products, in aggregate, we could see substantive changes in terms of sodium reduction, and it would allow consumers' taste preferences to adjust to lower sodium levels over time. So before we could go about establishing the targets, the first thing we had to understand was what the food supply looked like at baseline, and that involved building a couple of new nutrition databases. So our first step was collect robust information about sodium, and we identified over 80 categories of food that contributed the most to sodium in the diet, and this was based on academic literature. So packaged food categories, when we started out, included groupings like breads and rolls, canned soup, and main entree sources that contribute to salt intake and were recognizable to consumers. We then compared these categories to the categories that already existed in the UK from their sodium reduction work. We compared them to FDA product categories and Nielsen product modules to make these categories more relevant to industry. And then we built two separate databases, one for packaged food and another for restaurant food, with publicly available nutrition information and proprietary sales data. So for packaged food, we merged sales data with label nutrition data by UPC in order to calculate a sales weighted mean sodium for food categories, which is similar to the approach that we heard earlier from the UK. So for each packaged food category, we analyzed food that fell into the top 80% of sales and calculated the sales weighted mean and range of sodium. And calculating the sales weighted mean allowed the products that are sold most frequently to factor more heavily into the entire calculations when we looked at the baseline data and assessed the mean. And then for restaurant foods, we merged national market share data with publicly available nutrition data for the top 50 largest quick service restaurant chains based on sales. And we were then able to calculate a market share weighted mean and a range of sodium for each category of these restaurant foods. So basically, these databases allowed us to assess the mean and range of sodium content by category, brand, and manufacturer, which informed how we define categories and set our targets. And then additional details on this process can be found in the Institute of Medicine's report on strategies to reduce sodium. So our next step in the process was to use the databases that we built to propose targets for each of the categories. Once we calculated the sales weighted mean sodium within each category, we reviewed the mean and range and took a number of considerations into account before we determined the appropriate percent reduction and the targets for each category. So first, we looked at examples of substantial reduction that had already been achieved, whether in the UK or the US. So in the UK, for example, as part of their target setting process, there were some reductions that were achieved of up to 40%. We also considered some of the documented technical challenges that existed publicly and in the literature throughout the target setting process. And then finally, considering industry feedback was a really important piece of our process. We completed meetings for each of these categories with industry, and at those meetings, we presented the baseline data, the range of sodium within the category, the sales weighted mean, our proposed targets, and used those discussions as an opportunity to solicit feedback. So companies had an opportunity to either engage with us in a group based on the category they participated in one-on-one meetings, through their trade associations, or they also had an ability to submit written comments to us. So in summary, all of the targets were proposed based on analyzing the databases that we built, considering the UK targets, assessing feasibility, and then they were further refined based on industry comments and ongoing discussions. The next step was to actually release the targets. So in January of 2010, we published proposed targets, which incorporated the feedback from the meetings and the discussions we had had with industry, and we provided an opportunity for additional technical comment. Finally, we adjusted the targets based on that feedback, and we announced final targets and the first set of commitments to them in April of 2010. We ended up with 62 packaged food categories, which fall into the main categories that you can see listed in the table here. For the remainder of the discussion today, I'm going to focus on the packaged food categories instead of the restaurant categories. It's important to note that these categories that we developed were not exhaustive, but were intended to be broad and address a range of foods. The targets, again, similar to the UK's model, were measured in terms of sodium density. So we looked at milligrams of sodium per 100 grams of product or 100 milliliter of product. And the reason why we looked at density was because we didn't want companies to just be able to adjust the serving size to get closer to meeting the targets. And targets applied to a company's overall sales weighted mean within a category. So I'll walk through in the next slide what that kind of looks like in practice, but what this means is that not all products within a category had to meet the sales weighted mean target. Some could sit above and some could sit below, but in aggregate, the sales weighted mean target for the category had to be at or below the target by the target year. So this graph illustrates distribution of sodium across products in a sample category and will show how the NSSRI targets actually facilitated sodium reduction. The number of products is on the y-axis and the sodium content is along the x-axis. In this example, the sales weighted mean at baseline is 531 milligrams. As companies move towards meeting the 2012 or 2014 targets, what we see is that variety will remain within the category, but the overall sodium will decrease within the category and the distribution will move closer to that target. So again, when a company commits to meeting an NSRI target for a specific category, they're committing to moving closer to this target, and they can still have some products that sit above and some products that sit below, but overall achieving an aggregate mean of being at this target by the target year. And there are a couple of different ways that a company could go about achieving this. So within the model, they could reformulate to lower the sodium in their products. They could remove sodium-dense products from the market entirely. They could introduce newer, lower sodium products, or they could not reformulate or touch any of the products at all, but instead shift their portfolio via marketing to influence the sales-weighted mean. And as we can see, this provides companies with a good amount of flexibility, which is why we landed on a sales-weighted mean target as the central part of the framework for the NSRI. So as a summary, in 2009, we held a series of meetings with restaurant and packaged food companies and their trade associations to set the food category targets. We announced those targets in 2010 and began the phase of soliciting company commitments. The target years were set at 2012 and 2014, and then we assessed changes in the food supply over time. We've completed several evaluations to date, and we continue to plan to monitor sodium in the food supply, and I'll walk you through the high-level results of a couple of those evaluations in subsequent slides. So the next key component of our strategy was to invite companies to commit once the targets were final, and we ended up, as I said, with a total of 28 company commitments. So when we think about the progress of the initiative achieved, we like to think about the engagement we received both throughout the target setting process and in the commitment phase. So you can see the list of companies that committed here, 28 in total. That included 19 packaged food companies, 4 supermarkets and food distributors, and 5 restaurant chains. And companies range from large multinational companies to smaller, more local organizations, and like I said, some are in the room here with us today. So companies committed to meet specific category targets and pledged to reduce their sodium sales-weighted mean to be at or below the target by either 2012 and or 2014. And they had to commit to at least one target that they didn't already meet. Companies also submitted monitoring forms along with their data to track their progress. And among these companies, we saw many examples of sodium reduction, even among some pretty iconic products. So for example, Heinz Ketchup reduced their sodium by 15%. The Subway Italian BMT sandwich reduced their sodium density by 27%, and Kraft Singles American Slices came down 18%. And the initiative was viewed very favorably by the media and the public at large. So in this slide, you can see some of the media coverage that we received during the beginning of the initiative, which was a great opportunity for the organizations that committed. What this told us was that different kinds of companies of all sizes and structures across a wide range of products could adopt this flexible framework, and we saw this as a really exciting endorsement. So the last part of our strategy that I'll walk through today is monitoring changes. As a data-driven agency, evaluation is important for all of our work, and assessing the progress of the NSRI was no exception. Monitoring changes is the last key component of this strategy, and the New York City Health Department analyzed changes in sodium content over the course of the NSRI, both of the committed companies and of the food industry as a whole. So we assessed progress in 2 different ways. Primarily, we tracked sodium in the food supply by updating the packaged and restaurant food databases that I mentioned earlier in both 2012 and 2014. This allowed us to track the progress of the companies that committed, in addition to looking at the progress within a specific food category and among the food supply overall. Committed companies also had the opportunity to submit product level data for their committed categories at baseline and at 2012 and at 2014. And this supplemental data was beneficial for smaller products that maybe didn't fall within the top 80% of the sales that we included in our database, or for private label brands as well. So since the target deadline, there have been a series of academic papers that were published, and I'll walk you through the high-level results of 3 of them today. So the first paper is called U.S. Food Industry Progress During the NSRI, and the objective was to assess the packaged food industry's progress towards meeting the targets. Using the packaged food database that we built, we assessed target achievement and change in the sales weighted mean sodium density in 61 food categories from baseline through the interim targets through the final targets. And what we found was that from 2009 to 2014, the sales weighted mean sodium density declined significantly in almost half of the food categories. And overall, sales weighted mean sodium density declined significantly across all of the packaged food categories by 6.8%. So the objective of the second paper was to assess whether serving size or nutrient content changed across the NSRI categories to assess if any reformulation that may have taken place would have had an impact on the nutrient profile of products. And the key finding here was that reductions in calorie and sodium density occurred in tandem. This suggests that manufacturers reformulated for more than one health goal at the same time. So instead of unintended negative consequences of reformulation, a net nutritional benefit actually occurred among the products that were reformulated. And then the last paper that I'll talk about today was a modeling exercise completed by colleagues at the CDC. And the objective was to model the potential impact of US sodium intake by applying voluntary sodium targets. So the paper used NHANES data to assess what sodium intake would look like based on voluntary targets from the US, so using the NSRI framework, and also looking at the targets set by Health Canada. So the key finding was that sodium intake would decline. The proportion of adults consuming greater than 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day would come down from 88% to 27% if the NSRI targets were met, and would come down to 74% if Health Canada's benchmarks were met. So what's next? Let's spend a few minutes looking ahead. We're continuing surveillance to monitor the food supply to track reductions in sodium content. We've actually updated the data again so that we can continue to look at changes in sodium density from when the initiative ended in 2014 through 2018. We're also optimistic about FDA action on short-term targets. As you know, the FDA announced that it was interested in establishing voluntary guidance to reduce sodium in the food supply and opened up the comment period back in 2016. And then in April, former FDA Commissioner Gottlieb indicated that guidance was in final clearance inside the FDA. So as the health department, we're continuing to advocate for the release of both short-term and long-term guidance, and we'd encourage members of industry to consider meeting those targets once they're finalized. And I think it's important to note that companies that committed to the NSRI are better positioned for this FDA guidance, and some are actually advocating for the release of this guidance. So we decided to use the framework that we've developed and the partnership that we've built, which we've been keeping up over the past couple of years, to expand our focus to include added sugars. And you can see that the story is fairly similar. So like our past work on sodium, we know that most of the sugar that Americans eat and drink come from packaged foods and prepared foods, not the sugar that somebody is adding to the food when they're cooking or when they're baking. And we also see a range of processed foods contributing to sugar in the diet, such as beverages, snacks, sweets, in addition to some unexpected sources like salad dressings and sauces. And 68% of packaged foods and beverages purchased in the US today include some kind of caloric sweetener. And again, we think that this emphasizes the role that industry has in shaping diets. We know that similar to sodium, adults and children are consuming far more than recommended, and the intake of added sugar is associated with negative health outcomes. And we're excited that we're seeing recognition of the problem and interest from some key members of industry, and we think that, again, this represents an opportunity to implement a framework that can accelerate this work and encourage the involvement of companies across the board and not just by a few key players. So at a very high level, this was the development of our sugar reduction targets, which is fairly similar to what we did in sodium reduction. So our first step was to build a database to assess the food supply at baseline. We then drafted categories that contribute the most to added sugar in the diet, and we created preliminary targets and released them to industry for feedback. And then we've updated our categories and targets once based on the feedback we received. We re-released them in July, and we're currently in the middle of a second comment period, which closes on September 6th. We anticipate that the updated targets will be released later this year. with targets to be set in 2023 and 2026. So I'm certainly open to further conversations if you want to talk more about ways to get involved and help shape the process and the progress of this initiative. So what did we learn from the NSRI? First, we learned that the model works. The strength of the partnership was a critical piece of demonstrating a shared interest across organizations nationally. We also saw that it produced results by seeing a 6.8% sales-weighted mean sodium density decline in the food supply from 2009 to 2014. Second, we know that engaging industry is critical. So 28 companies committed, with even more engaged in providing feedback. This is important as we recognize that the members of the food and beverage industry are the food reformulation experts and need to have a seat at the table when we're designing initiatives like this. And third, we learned that local policy has the potential to influence federal action. So an initiative developed and led by a city government with a coalition from local government and other organizations from across the country was able to implement an innovative model for shifting our food supply. The FDA has been receptive, and companies that have been involved along the way are now the best positioned for federal guidance. So I'd like to thank everybody for their time today. Do you have any questions?